In the almost 10 years Overwatch has been running, we have gotten a multitude of reworks and adjustments that were meant to update and modernize older heroes that were outdated or clearly made for a different version of the game. For example, we have Soldier's and Symmetra's major reworks that made them less niche and static in favor of a more dynamic kit that allowed for more skill expression and versatility. Other reworks were done to reduce the frustration and problematic components of a hero's kit, like with Mercy's mass res being swapped with her current ultimate, or Briggs' minor rework shifting her power from her absurd self-survivability in favor of better supportive options. That being said, over time there have been multiple times where Blizzard tried to rework a hero, but either never made it to the live version of the game, was eventually reverted or reworked again, as the update not only didn't fix the issues with the hero, but potentially made it worse. As we get closer to Season 3, which has been confirmed by Blizzard to be a season dedicated to change and rework some heroes, I decided to take a look at the multiple cancelled and failed reworks to see if there is something of value on those versions that might come up in the future. One of the most historically requested heroes to receive a rework has to be Moira. With her lack of utility outside raw healing and damage outputs, and a very slow kill floor and ceiling, players have over the years proposed multiple potential changes to make her more skillful and a better support to have in your team. Well, the funny thing is that Moira has been a subject of not one but two reworks that haven't made it to the live version of the game. The first one was implemented on the experimental card, which, if you don't know what it was essentially a mode where Blizzard will try out riskier changes that could or could not eventually be added to the base game. It's important to mention this as multiple of these cancelled reworks come from here. The rework would allow Moira's Fade to turn allies close to her untargetable at the end of Fade. A pretty small change, but an interesting one when you consider Kiriko wasn't even a concept when this came out, as you could say it was the predecessor of Zuzu. That being said, while this change did allow Moira to provide a unique form of utility at that time, this made effect at the end of Fade, it was very ineffective at what it was originally intended to do, since you would need to preemptively waste your only movement ability and anticipate that an enemy would use some specific cooldown a second before it happened, which made it very unreliable. At the same time, having access to what could sometimes seem as random AoE and targetability every 8 seconds was very frustrating to deal with. It's basically half of Zuzu's cooldown, so I'm sure you can see why that was the case. On the other hand, a somewhat more interesting rework was the one she received during Overwatch 2's beta, which replaced her damage orb with Necrotic Orb, which was a small and somewhat hard to land skill shot that reduced the target's damage substantially while separating her orbs to have individual cooldowns. This rework yet again tried to provide Moira with a unique form of utility, as well as increasing her skill floor by adding a skill shot that actually required the Moira player to aim. Unfortunately, this version had a lot of issues that really pushed her away from her target audience. The players who play Moira simply don't want to have to deal with aiming as part of the skill set needed to be effective with her, and that's totally fine. There are other ways to improve her skill expression that aren't just add skill shot and be done for. At the same time, the effect of Necrotic Orb was absurdly overpowered when it landed, as it was a 75% damage reduction, but didn't feel particularly good for the user and was extremely frustrating to go against. Imagine you're playing Genji and your blade gets rendered useless for 4 seconds. Giving the enemy more than enough time to escape or even kill you. It was also another defensive ability for her that had an even longer cooldown than Zuzu or Nade, hindering the more aggressive playstyle that a lot of Moira players enjoy. Lastly, it removed the choice between her orbs, as they now had separate cooldowns, taking away one of the few choices and skill expressions she already had. I personally believe granting some utility to her orbs is the correct choice, but they shouldn't drastically change their functionality to do so. They could have just added a smaller damage or heal reduction on the current orb and it would have worked a lot better. At the end of the day, Moira is extremely popular, so any change made to her needs to be done carefully, as they could alienate her from her current player base. Another support that's on a similar boat is Mercy, who not only is usually a heavy request when it comes to receiving a rework, but she's also a very popular and intended to be an entry-level hero for newer players, so making any meaningful change can be difficult. Mercy is a hero that usually feels horrible to play with, especially if you're a tank player, but also has access to some of the most situationally powerful and healthy abilities in the entire game, with res and damage boost. Blizzard did try some years ago a meaningful rework, again in the experimental card, that swapped her res and Valkyrie, making res AoE again, but with a slow cast time, and changing Valkyrie into a short duration movement and small heal boost ability for Mercy, so she could actually have a cooldown to manage, and an extremely niche ability that's incredibly binary in output without removing her identity and iconic ability, but reducing its availability, especially at the start of a round. There are very interesting aspects here, and I believe this is a much better rework than either of Moira's, not only respecting her current player base and even amplifying her hero identity by boosting her movement options, but it also increased her skill ceiling and reduced the frustration from res. So much so that I actually made a video going over how I would rework every support hero, and my version for Mercy was heavily inspired by it. The only major difference is that I would have reduced the absurd cooldown of Bulk and shift rest from a slow cast time AoE to a fast single target rest with a stronger effect, at the cost of reducing the power of damage boost, which I think many players would appreciate. The problem with the experimental version and why Blizzard didn't go forward with it had to do with how hard to use rest was as an AoE ultimate. It was usually used as the current version, resting a single target that died far away from combat, which isn't exactly exciting as an ultimate, and since they didn't take power from damage boost, Valkyrie had an absurd 17 seconds cooldown that used to be 20, and forced Mercy players to save it up as a last resource tool to escape any form of pressure. A lower cooldown at the cost of some damage boost would have made Mercy's kit flow a lot better and provide a lot more impact for the team outside pocketing a hitscan DPS. The next hero we have to talk about is the second most reworked hero in the game, Symmetra. Steam had both a failed and a cancelled rework. It was actually more of a joke rework made by a content creator, but still worth talking about. Symmetra received a major rework almost 9 years ago, very shortly after the game came out. The rework's goal was to make Symmetra a more functional hero, because honestly the release version was completely unplayable, providing her stronger outputs and a bit more of selfishness to her kit, pushing her more into a defensive hero and less of a poor man's support. This rework gave Sim the photon shield you can now see as a major perk, maintaining her primary fire that locked onto targets, and her slow but piercing secondary fire, and providing her an alternative ultimate from her old teleport, a shield generator that you placed away from combat and would provide 75 shields to any hero in its range. This version of Sim was still complete garbage in 90% of scenarios, while she was still basically the best hero while defending on the now removed 2CP maps. Her shield generator, combined with her 6 turrets, made her an annoying anchor in maps with small choke points like Hanamura or Anubis, but left her still completely hopeless in almost every other scenario. Her primary dealt no damage despite having a lock-on, her secondary was absurdly slow, and she had no mobility or defensive tools when someone jumped on you, so she had to play as far back as possible, waiting to farm her shield generator or TP to make taking a point impossible until you destroy them. Her shield didn't even have the functionality to slow it down like you can do now with the major perk, so it was even less useful in most situations. Honestly, there is nothing worth saving here, and I believe the current version of Sim, while not perfect, is a vast improvement compared to her previous iterations. The rework from the experimental mode was a what if rather than pushing her away from Bursman support, they made her into an actual support with healing output and stronger utility. Her turrets were now healing turrets, and again, way before Illari was even an idea, so you can see how some of these experiments still live on in some capacity. Her TP gave movement speed and her damage was lowered overall. This version was an interesting alternative to be honest, and I quite liked it. Since she had multiple turrets, she felt a lot more creative and less restrained than Illari with her pylon, and she still retained the unique teleport that was incredible at enabling certain tanks and DPS, making her a very powerful and unique support at the time. She was a support that could still actively provide pressure and damage while sustaining allies, as well as being able to support from multiple positions thanks to the low cooldown and multiple turrets you could have at the same time. Again, I really like how she plays currently as a DPS, and Illari already took the spot of the turret support, but I can't deny how much I would have liked for this to be how she plays out currently. Moving on to tanks, we have the most recently reverted rework on Hawk's Big Ben. If you just recently started playing or came back after some years, basically Blizzard decided to add a layer to Hawk's one-shot so he didn't feel as annoying to fight against, as well as providing him some other form of utility that isn't just his hook, as he had become a very problematic on a 5v5 format where there is only one hero per team he can't one-shot and could help mitigate his pressure, leading to huge nerfs that removed his one-shot and made him basically the worst hero in the entire game. The way they added that layer was by adding a trap that after a small duration would slightly launch up enemies and creating a slowing field zone that would also deal a good chunk of damage, so he could potentially one-shot but needed to set up his trap previously, as well as being able to use the trap prior to the hook to make it easier to land thanks to the slow. It could also be used after a hook combo, throwing it behind the enemy, which would lead into a kill as most enemies would just walk backwards, activating it. Sadly, traps just aren't very functional in Overwatch. The game is too fast-paced to make setup abilities reliable or consistent, and would basically force Hawk players to just hold a corner with his trap, waiting for someone to get close and one-shotting them. Any other use case was too unreliable, as it was very easy to just destroy or avoid as it had a build-up time. This rework also changed how his shotgun worked, unifying both his primary and secondary fire into a weird combined shot that would launch 4 big projectiles and a bunch of smaller ones, so he would deal more reliable damage at mid-range without making him absurdly deadly up close. The issue with this is that Blizzard just didn't even care to adjust its numbers properly. While it may seem like his new primary would have decent range, the crazy fall-off and slow projectiles it had made it somehow even worse than his current secondary, so he relied even more around one-shotting enemies and providing zero value elsewhere, limiting not only his positioning but actively harming his role as a soul tank in 5v5. Eventually, Blizzard would just remove the trap since clearly it wasn't working, and revert how his shotgun worked, separating his primary and secondary, allowing him to freely one-shot people like he did on the first season and most of Overwatch 1. Something I'm sure everyone likes and isn't making ranked an absolute pain in the ass now that he's viable again. Honestly, I made a 20 minutes long video about Hog already, so I am not going to repeat every issue with him in depth. If you want to see how I would rework him, you can check it out, but in summary, I would change how his hook functions so it isn't a fast single pull, but smaller pulls that last a bit longer, and giving him back Pigpen, but as an AoE slow field that's instantly activated rather than a trap, as well as some minor adjustments to his other abilities. Now we move on to the most reworked hero in the entire history of Overwatch, Sombra. Another hero I dedicated a whole video talking about her state and problems already, and the only hero confirmed to be receiving a final rework in Season 3. I will believe it when I see it. They actually cancelled the rework pretty close to being greenlit into the live game a few months ago that, based on some hints, would have either moved her to the support role or a very supportive DPS, but that relied more on team utility and help path hacking rather than having a 6-second silence like in Overwatch 1. Ultimately, this rework was cancelled due to the devs feeling like her identity was lost and it didn't feel like Sombra. With the other examples, I did mention how their identity is a very important aspect when it comes to reworking them, but Sombra's is so fundamentally flawed and problematic that I'm not so sure it needs to be kept intact. Going over her previous iterations, Translocator went from being something you set up with a timer, which was very limiting and forced her to play completely around her timer, to an ability with no timer that was completely unhealthy to play against, as she had 100% uptime offset tool, meaning she could always escape unless you got stunned, which, mind you, was very limited in Overwatch 2, since they had removed multiple crowd control abilities from the game. Now it's the dash with a delay that procs her invisibility, which suffered basically the same changes over the years. It went from having a timer to no timer to limited to her translocator and with a timer. The version that failed the most though was the one when they changed her invisibility into a passive that lasted indefinitely until she shot someone or got shot. Yes, you could even hack someone while staying invisible for some goddamn reason. This version led with Sombra players in lower levels simply walking into the enemy backline with zero issue or risk, hacking the enemy support that was further away from the team, try to burst them with virus, and if that failed, they simply threw Translocator, turning her invisible again and running away to the nearest health pack and repeat. And since she sucked in neutral in most map and choke points, why would you ever play her differently? There are videos from Question from that era where you actually could see a more neutral based Sombra playstyle, but her kit discouraged it too much by design to make it the norm. This playstyle was very problematic in lower ranks, and especially in console, where turning around is objectively harder, leading to multiple nerfs that would simply leave her unviable in any rank where people had a brain, and eventually force Blizzard to rework her again, removing stealth as a passive and reducing her downtimes a bit so she could provide some value outside these scenarios. Still garbage though. As you can see, a hero that has access to a silence, invisibility, and an escape tool is simply bound to have a toxic gameplay loop that can never remain viable, as it would lead into permabans like it did in the past. So it's probably for the best that her identity at the very least shifts around a little bit to make the hero a better design for how Overwatch is meant to be played currently. I am honestly not entirely sold on Sombra as a support, as the changes she would need would honestly be pretty big and would shift her away too much from the stealthy hacker she is currently. Thanks all everyone. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing and leaving down in the comments what you think about these reworks and who do you want to see reworked in Season 3. It helps a ton. I have other similar discussion videos you can check out, and I hope to see you next time.